Now, some of the Alathians and Anarans had what would be called supernatural powers. The more powerful ones, such as Aline and Alpha, had an entire playbook of powers that would take a 7-year-old an hour to alphabetize. Trust me, I experimented extensively to come up with that timeline. It wasn't easy, and I'm not proud. I lied. Yes, I am. Back to the point. Others such as Fears only had the standard array of power, like the slowed combat, I'll explain that later, and maybe a more unique power here and there. In Fears' case, extreme accuracy with every ranged weapon, including, much to my surprise, rubber band guns. Bullseye. Every time. Confounded man. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 5. Attacking the lair, defending the castle. Bridget. I've seen the end. Bridget stood atop the walls with Aline to her left and Fears to her right. The wall overlooked the small section of land between them and the chasm that circumnavigated the fortress like a bottomless moat. The only way across the drawbridge was the drawbridge, and the only way in was through the reinforced steel portcullis and thick wooden gate. The fortress was designed in such a way that it was meant to be defended by no more than 300 men, yet if need be it could be held by a mere 30. The numbers were only helpful for the fighting outside of the walls and in the maze-like tunnels beneath the castle. The oddly designed drawbridge was down presently, as it was always kept, unless it was apparent that the attack would not be rebuffed by the archers normally stationed on the walls. The wind was blisteringly cold. Her lips were cracked and bloodied, her ears stung, and her nose was reddened and on the verge of bleeding from the sheer force of the wind. Aline's were the same, yet she seemed unfazed. Below, Bridget could see Caden standing in front of the Alathian men. She could hear his voice driving spirit into them. The view was inspiring. Directly below was the clearing before the chasm, covered in wild, untamed grass. The chasm itself caused her stomach to fall just from imagining how far down the pit went. According to the locals, it didn't have a bottom, but that couldn't have been true. The bridge that stretched the expanse was odd in its two-tier design. The bottom layer was wide enough to fit 20 men across, whereas the top was connected to the bottom by small ramps on the left and right sides of the bottom tier. It was built for no more than 5 men in formation. The bottom was simple in its design, being that it was only a wooden pathway with no guardrails to speak of. The top, however, was slightly more complex. It, of course, was made of wood, and was much the same as the bottom in that it was no more than a pathway. The top, though, did have a railing. The railing was made of metal, and was a continuous stream of X's that were as tall as 2 men, and about as wide as one laying down. All of this was covered by a wooden ceiling. Bridget assumed that the bottom was used for carts and people, and the top was probably just used on more crowded days for people alone. "It'll have to be rebuilt," Aline commented softly. "If the rains keep up, which they will, the wood will rot away. The wood rots, the bridge falls. Simple as that. As a matter of fact, the rot is already beginning to eat at the wood." "That'll make fighting on it a whole lot of fun," Fears said sarcastically. "You and I have very different definitions of fun," Aline responded coldly. "Let's keep this simple," she said, turning to Bridget. "You need to know the ins and outs of these defenses if you are to help us. Unfortunately, we don't have time for you to study it in detail. Fortunately, however, we have alternatives." She walked right up in front of Bridget, stopping inches in front of her face. "Close your eyes," she whispered. "Hold your breath, don't panic, and try not to die," she breathed as she brushed Bridget's hair out of her face. Her mind started to cloud with her heartbeat racing as Aline's fingertips brushed her face. She briefly felt the cold of Aline's breath upon her lips before Aline's lips pressed lightly against hers. When she opened her eyes, everything had changed, and she was no longer on top of the wall. To her left was a man with a spear and a large shield. To her right was the mirror image. She looked down at her own hands and found that she too held a spear in her right hand and a large shield strapped to her left. The ground shook beneath her, and the air was filled with battle cries. In front of her, an ocean of men charged from the forest. Bridget raised her shield and gripped her spear with sweaty palms and shaking arms. They didn't stand a chance, yet they stood nonetheless. I always found it odd how much more time Alpha spent tutoring Caden as opposed to Bridget. Why does it seem he wanted Caden so badly? He clearly couldn't measure up to the strength that any of the 3-in-1 would possess at the height of their power. Would Caden betray Aletheia for a father figure? Oh well. Perhaps I'll just ask Alpha next time he's over for tea. Though he doesn't talk much when he visits. Maybe it's because of all the tubes. Ponderings for another time. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 5. Continued. Caden. Measured recklessness. The forest was dark and eerie, and more so than usual. I constantly had the sense that something was watching us, or some things. Allyra was on my left, but just a few steps behind me. Her bow had an arrow notched, but the string was not drawn. She scanned the forest warily with her hood still down. Rain crouched to my right with her sword drawn. She was afraid, and she only hit it moderately well. Indara took up the rear, walking backwards skillfully, avoiding tripping on the underbrush. I led in the front, crouched with my right hand resting on the hilt of my sword, which remained in its scabbard. I had to maintain the illusion of calm, even if I didn't feel it. The rain fell heavily, soaking us all to the bone. The wind howled in the trees, but the thickness of the forest prevented it from blowing as strongly where we were. The skies had grown dark as night had descended. Clouds had choked out the lights of the stars and the moon. Light, however, was provided for us by the Elathian weather that had come with Lord Varen's signing of the contract. The rain no longer fell as clear water. In the dark nights, the rain fell with a glow of an icy blue. It lit the skies as it fell, and the ground as puddles gathered in small rivers. It lost its glow as it soaked into our clothes, but retained its light when it first landed on our skin. We crept along, following a trail of trampled brush and trees purposely marked with the claws of the wolf. Walking into trap was never easy, and it was always nerve-wracking. We followed anyway. What other choice did we have? I looked over to Allyra and regretted it almost immediately. Her medium-length blonde hair looked dark as it dripped with water clinging mostly to the sides of her face, but some of it covered her ice-blue eyes, which matched the rain in both color and glow. Her sharp features complemented her petite frame, outlined by the wet clinging of her clothes, and contrasted against the size of the dark brown bow she held. Her cheeks were almost as taut as her bowstring, but not quite. Her brows were light brown and thin, accenting her slightly large eyes. Her blue cloak looked almost black from the rain, as did everyone else's. Her gray shirt pressed against the contours and curves of her feminine features, outlining her breasts and clinging to her toned stomach. All of this I caught in a glance before she pulled her cloak more tightly around her as a strong breeze blew through the trees. She donned her hood against the rain, brushing her hair from her face. I hated myself for being distracted as long as I was, but I couldn't help but admire what I'd seen. The rain had always made features more attractive to me. As such, I had noticed Rain's dark hair contrasting with her golden eyes, and her clothes pressed against her slightly more endowed body. Even Indara looked all the more fierce, with glowing water dripping from his face, causing his dark blue eyes to hide in the night. The rain even caused the steel of our weapons to shine. I felt my dark hair pressed against my face and water dripping from my chin. My clothes and armor felt heavy and drove the cold through me every time the wind blew. I did not close my cloak against it, but instead closed my eyes and embraced the chills that racked my body. In those moments, I could hear the rustling of the leaves in the trees. I could feel the swaying of the grass around me. Even the water dripping from my gloves and the smell of the wet forest floor were woven into the intricate pattern of my senses. I held up my hand, gesturing for the group to stop and crouch low. There was something mingling in with the smells, something that didn't belong. I opened my eyes briefly, watching Allyra as she opened her cloak as well, opening her mouth and taking in the scents of the woods, copying my actions. She seemed to be quick to learn. I hoped she would be something special, but only time would tell. In time, I may have even brought it to Aline's attention if any of us survived. I closed my eyes again, instantly recognizing the discrepancy. The smell of rotting flesh was unique, even against the smell of rotting greenery, and I thought that I vaguely caught a hint of wet dog as well. "We're close," Allyra whispered. Apparently she smelled it too. "Close to what?" Indara asked softly. "If I knew that," I responded, not bothering to finish the sentence. We started moving again, as silently as we could, until we reached the edge of a large bowl. Below us was a large clearing pocked with holes that were once unmarked graves. One of the holes stood out amongst the rest. It was larger by far, and dirt piled up along its sides. We could only see down it at an angle, but I had the feeling that it went pretty far down. The stench here was stronger, yet I could pick out the smell of wet fur. Each and every one of those holes glowed icy blue as the rain had filled most of them to the point of overflowing, all but the largest one. The effect was eerily beautiful. We picked our way down the hill slowly and cautiously. Allyra's bow was taut and her eyes scanned everything. I took now as an excellent opportunity to draw my sword. I'd hoped to waited for a longer time, my armored gloves thick enough for me to grasp the blade of the weapon without cutting it into my skin. I'd hoped that with a less orthodox weapon, I might be able to catch the wolf off guard. There was little chance of that, though. I held the weapon with my right hand on the blade and the left on the hilt. I motioned to my men, and we took up a circle around the largest hole, staying back from the perimeter. It was then that I was sure that the stench was coming from whatever was down there. We slowly made our way to the edge, and on the count of 3 looked over the top. All we could see was darkness. "Caden, my boy!" a deep voice called out from the direction we had come. The wolf sauntered down the hill in his fully human form. He wore ragged black pants and a blood-red long sleeve that was ripped beyond any recognition. Over this, a military-style black jacket that was tattered and worn. We all turned aggressively, brandishing our weapons. "Come now, aren't you going to introduce me to your—" I heard the sharp wisp of a bowstring loosening and the whistle of an arrow flying through the air, cutting through the rain. It contacted the wolf dead in his left shoulder. He stumbled back, looking stunned. He grunted and gripped the arrow in his right hand. I chanced to glance at Alira. Her hood was down, but I swore that I saw a smile teasing at her lips. I looked back to the wolf, as I heard a deep laugh. "I like her, Caden," he said, ripping the arrow from his shoulder. "She's a keeper," he growled with a smile that revealed his elongated canines. He awkwardly drew his sword with his right hand. His grip still looked strong and confident. I heard Alira's bow draw again. The wolf started a slow walk towards us. Alira let loose another arrow, but the wolf sidestepped the arrow before it had left her bow. He stalked forward as Indera charged, and Alira loosed another arrow. The wolf flicked his right wrist, spinning the sword and catching the arrow in front of his face before deflecting it off to the side. Indera reached the wolf as he brought down a diagonal swing from his right to his left. Indera caught it with both blades, glancing it down to the ground. He brought about the dagger in his left hand to stab the wolf in the neck, but the wolf was too fast. The wolf dropped his sword and grabbed Indera by the arm in a fraction of a second. Before anything else could happen, an arrow thudded in the wolf's extended arm. He wasted no time half-shifting. As strength returned to his left arm, he grabbed Indera across his lower chest, striding forward and lifting him into the air, tossing him the full distance between us and him. Indera hit the ground hard in front of the hole, sticking his right blade into the mud in an attempt to stop his momentum as the majority of his body slipped into the hole. As he slid backwards, Rain attempted to grab onto his hand, but only succeeded in sliding into the hole straight after Indera. The hole echoed with their mixed cries as they fell into the blackness. The wolf retrieved his fallen sword, picking it up with his muscled gray left hand. I charged at him, but this time I remembered to be controlled. I stopped short of him as he threw his blade down in a vertical cut. I lifted my sword above my head, holding it with my right hand on the blade. As the impact came, I loosened my grip with my right hand, sliding the blade harmlessly off to my right. I had allowed my blade to drop just enough for me to be able to bring the hilt crashing into the wolf's jaw. He stumbled only a step or two, bringing his sword back from the ground as he went. I ducked under the blade as I re-gripped my blade with both hands. I spun low to the ground, gathering momentum as I released with my right and rose with my swing. There was surprise on the wolf's face as he tried to add a couple of steps to his stumble to avoid my blade. The longer blade, however, was just enough to clip his lower chest, but not enough to seriously wound. He was still stumbling when an arrow landed itself in his stomach. It didn't go as deep as it should have, nor did it seem to injure him as much as would be expected. The wolf laughed deeply, with his hands placed on his knees as if he was catching his breath. I saw him cough out blood, spitting it into the mud below as he half-shifted back down into a man. My, Caden, you learn," he started before getting cut off by another arrow through the top of his exposed collarbone. "Fuck!" he cursed, staring at Alira exasperatedly. "God damn it, woman!" "It's force of habit," she responded with a smile. "What is?" he snarled. "Interrupting people mid-sentence?" "Nah," she said, notching another arrow and drawing her string. "Shooting assholes," she answered. "Now drop the blade. Next arrow lands in the head." "This," the wolf said, looking back to me, "is where you learn a lesson in measured recklessness." He growled low as his shift took a turn for the canine. He roared, coming at me crouching low. I held my sword diagonally in front of myself. He would have swatted a stab to the side. As such, my only hope was to brace myself for the impact. It'd probably kill me, but I didn't have time to roll to the side. He ducked under my sword, grabbing onto me in a massive hug, lifting me into the air, taking us several steps towards the hole. I yelled through the pain of getting crushed and responded in kind, pulling my sword towards myself and pressing into the base of the wolf's neck. He roared, fighting my strength. In the end, he'd win. but I wasn't the type to submit. I could feel my grip slipping as we careened towards the hole. I re-gripped and gave it one last pull. The wolf threw his head back, howling in anger and pain. His squeeze, however, became all the more harder. That was, right up until he took an arrow through the side of his muzzle. His grip slacked, and I took the opportunity to take a breath, but no sooner had he been shot than he had drawn his head back and half-shifted into a man, slamming his forehead right into the bridge of my nose. My eyes welled up with tears, and my nose began to bleed as he dropped me into the ground in a crumpled heap. He pulled the arrow from his cheek with a sharp tug. I landed on my back and attempted to stand, but he denied me with a strong backhand to the side of the head. My vision blurred and my balance fled me, leaving me completely incapacitated and dangerously close to the edge of the hole. My sword was still in my hand, but I sincerely doubted my ability to swing it at this point. The wolf crouched over me, regaining his composure, or at least trying to. Allyra had other plans for him, however. She had come from behind him and jumped onto his back, placing the wood of her bow around his neck. She crooked the sides of her bow between her elbows and drew back with all of her strength. The wolf stood, suddenly lifting Allyra into the air. He stumbled, clawing at the bow, but not finding any purchase. I struggled to stand, but to no avail. Even if I could have stood, I was seeing 2 wolves and 3.5 Allyras. I finally got to my knees as I looked up. Somehow, Allyra had wound up with the wolf holding her by the throat, right under her chin. Her back was bloodied, and her bow hung loosely in her hand. Her hood was down by now, and they both had their right sides to me. "Caden, you always bring such pretty little morsels along with you," he growled, running his claws lightly over her face. "That last one, what was her name?" He laughed deeply. "That was brilliant, by the way. She was so very upset." He hesitated for a second, and in my anger I tried to stand, but it didn't work. "Caden," he almost whispered, "no need to get angry. You'll be seeing her soon enough," he grumbled, lifting Allyra off of the ground by her chin and holding onto her hips in an effort not to pop her head off of her shoulder. She grunted through the pain as her face flushed red and her oxygen supply cut. "Well, you'll be seeing what's left of her anyway." I yelled as I stood and was about to run towards them, but I was only rewarded by the wolf throwing Allyra at me like nothing more than a sack of bones. I stopped moving and caught her as her back crashed into my chest. We both stumbled back the few steps leading to the hole and fell in. I closed my eyes and relaxed my body, and she did the same. After all, it was the best way to survive a fall, and for at least a little longer, I needed to live.
Chapter 5. Continued. Bridget. I have seen the end. Part 2. At this point, Bridget had died a dozen times, maybe more. She could no longer tell. First she had stood in front of the bridge, lined with allies bearing spears and shields. They had held the line as a mountain against the crashing waves, but as the mountain falls in time to the waves, so too did the Alathian forces to the Inarans. She had been one of the last to remain standing, fighting with a dented and broken shield, and a spear whose blade had been lost in the cutting of flesh and bone. Her arm had been broken from the fall of the hammer of a man twice her size, and the last moment of that life she had spent in the red mud, seeing the lifeless eyes of the bodies mingled around her. She had heard the moaning of the dying, saw the entrails spread upon the ground, and felt the warmth of the pool of blood beneath her. As she closed her eyes, a cool wind came across her, taking her away from the pain of the many wounds she had gathered. She had opened them only to find herself upon the bottom layer of the bridge. That time, she and the others had held short swords with their shields. They formed their wall and pushed back against the animals rushing towards them. Men and women from both sides had fallen from the bridge, screaming into the chasm as those dying upon the ground cried out against death. It had been a downhill battle, and Bridget was far from surprised when she had taken a blow to the back of the head that left her sprawled out on the ground with a terrible ringing in her ears. The ringing had grown louder and louder as blood had spilt from her mouth and nose until she closed her eyes again. As it had been before, she had opened her eyes to find herself somewhere else, this time on the top layer of the bridge. There she had fought beside men and women with much better training than those before. Most just seemed to have a natural affinity for battle. Those who had came at them were unfortunately more skilled than those below as well. Soon they were overwhelmed by pressing forces. The battle below had been lost, and she and the men beside her were soon flanked. She went down in a flurry of slashes and cuts. She was hit so many times that by the end she didn't even feel the blades falling upon her. After that, she had been on the wall. They had destroyed the bridge with well-aimed catapult fire. They had rained death down on the invaders with flaming arrows. The enemy had not been delayed long before they had brought large bridges to cover the gaps. They had dragged siege equipment across their bridges, all the while being fired upon by the archers. By the end of that cycle, there were enough corpses on the ground below to cushion the falls of those who were being thrown from the walls. The gate was bashed up, and the ladders were on the walls. The Alathian forces were overtaken quickly after that. Next, Bridget had fought alongside the others as they retreated further and further down the spirals and mazes beneath the castle. Months had passed before they had finally found themselves at the bottom. She and everyone else were starved and ragged. Broken bones and missing limbs were common among them. Weapons were not. 30, maybe 35 of them were gathered in a final clearing with a simple wooden door protecting them from the Anarans. The door had been battered open, and she and the others had been shot down by Anaran archers without a single casualty on their side. She lay on the ground dying for the last time, with more arrows in her than she had cared to count. An Anaran man turned her over with his boot and finished her with his sword through the chest. The pain cut through her, but the blade felt like ice. The cold winds took her for the last time as her head fell to the side. She saw the corpses around her and the blood pooling on the floor. She heard the laughs of the Anarans as her senses faded, and her last breath passed through her lips.
Oh, the look on their faces! Priceless. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 5. Continued. Caden, the Jacobin. We had been falling long enough for me to ask myself, am I still falling? As I held Alira, our fall suddenly turned horizontal as a rush of wind swept by us. Abruptly, the fall stopped. There was no jerking, there was no pain, and there was no impact. I opened my eyes to a room of torchlight. Alira rolled off of me, and we were on our feet in no time at all. I was strangely absent my sword, and she her bow. "Come on," I said, taking a few steps forward. There was no alternate path, only one tunnel that led forward. There was something thick and pungent tainting the air, and I knew my sleeve wouldn't help against it. I led Alira forward. She walked backwards as I continued on. In a very short while, we found ourselves in a large room. Its design was elaborate. Torches lined the designed wall, and strangely enough, intricate lines depicted scenes of a battle. It seemed that they told a story of violence, death, and heroism. The odd part was that the characters in the battle were not human, save for one. The battle seemed to be waged against two opposing forces, one side composed entirely of potatoes, and the other entirely of broccoli. I looked in front of me to find a long table. There were 8 chairs on one side and 8 on the opposing. At the head of the table sat a boy who had appeared to barely be hitting his teens. His hair was light brown and completely unkempt, styling itself into an odd form of faux hawk. His eyebrows were brown as well, and seemed as though they'd been combed upward to create a crazy or angry appearance. He wore nothing but a pair of pants that were made of the oddest material. They were green and appeared very comfortable. He stood as he noticed us, and the strange pants rose up beyond his ankles. He stood with an air of importance as the potatoes sitting at the side of the table rose too with their spears in hand. Tension built as the boy prepared to say something. "Would you like some tea?" he asked with a small smile, offering forward a glass. I didn't know what to think, other than all of this had to be an illusion, the boy asked. "I assure you, Commander, this is no mere fabrication of the mind. This is all very real. And the tea..." He paused, smiling maniacally as the potatoes brandished their weapons. "The tea is very good," he finished in an almost high-pitched squeal. "You simply must try it," he said, vaulting onto the table aggressively. "Where's the wolf?" I asked firmly, refusing to allow this crazed "Not an illusion!" the boy yelled in annoyance, walking forward. "Now, by wolf, I assume you mean our good friend Alpha," the boy said, returning to a calmer demeanor. "Who?" I asked, shaking my head in confusion. If that boy gets in my head one more time... "What? You're going to lose it, Commander? I'd say you already have." I looked at the boy with visible surprise written on my face, and he simply raised his eyebrows and then smiled. "Alpha," the boy said. "Now get this straight. I'm awesome. I can hear your thoughts. Alpha equals the wolf, and the wolf equals Alpha. And most importantly, this tea is delicious," he said, throwing the cup at me. I was going to dodge it, but suddenly tea appeared in my mouth before crawling down my throat. It was uncomfortable as all hell, but it really was delicious. "Now are we clear?" he asked calmly. "Because I'm getting really tired of repeating myself," he said before turning and walking back down the table towards where he had jumped up. I turned to Alira, reading the confusion on her face. I had no words, and neither did she. "My name is Jacob, by the way," he said, hopping off of the table, then suddenly appearing directly in front of me. "Some call me the Jacobin," he said with a smile, getting right up in my face. He was rather tall for a young teen. "And Heathers just call me—" "Ah!" he yelled in my face before turning around and appearing back in his chair. "I don't think has a positive connotation, though," he muttered quietly to himself. "I really must work on my social skills." Everything was quiet for a moment before he looked back up at us. "Now off you pop, you silly little mortals," he said, snapping his fingers, as I suddenly wound up back on my back with Alira on top of me, as we had been when we were falling. "And tell Alpha he really must stop by again. We do miss him ever so much, don't we, Glockenstein?" he asked one of the potatoes, who responded with a firm, "Yes, sir," before asking, "Shall they continue their fall, sir?" "Yes," the Jacobin responded. Suddenly we were falling again, landed in a pile of corpses. We rolled off together, and I found myself on top of Alira this time. Her expression was more than simple confusion. It was the clearest depiction of, "What the fuck?" she asked. I didn't know how to respond, so I just looked her in the eyes and said, "We tell no one." "But, Commander—" "No one," I repeated with force. "No one." Chapter 5. Continued. Bridget. Hold the bridge. Bridget gasped as her heart once again began beating. She sat up slowly, looking around her, and discovered that she once again stood atop the wall with Aline and Fears. She tried to shake the shock from her head, to no avail. "It has that effect the first time," Aline said calmly, without so much as looking at her. "And the second," Fears added. "And the third. And pretty much every damn time," he said, turning to her and offering her a hand to stand up. "The woman has a damn good kiss, eh?" "The best," Bridget responded dizzily. "I trust you saw what you needed to see," Aline remarked coldly. Her hands were crossed in front of her against the wind as she stared out into the forest. "Don't lose the bridge," Bridget responded. "It all starts sucking after that." "My thoughts exactly," Aline responded. So how do we go about not losing the bridge?" Fears asked, holding Bridget steady while she stood. Aline turned her head slowly to look at them before responding coolly. "We don't let them take it." There was silence for a moment as both Bridget and Fears prayed that there was a better explanation. Aline did a brisk about-face, taking a few steps until she came close enough for the doer to see the ice in her light blue eyes. "Bridget, there is one thing that you should be educated on. We, meaning us Alathians, are best when together. Most of us are best with a sword and shield covering the attacks of our allies. There are some of us, however, such as myself and Fierce, that have mastered the technique and gone beyond to learn to fight individually. Every Alathian man is worth 40 of the city guard, and every Alathian officer is worth about 5 of the enlisted men. They, meaning the Anarans, are vicious and fight with the ferocity of cornered animals. They operate as a wolf in a pack, individual, yet one in their cause. They arm themselves with whatever feels right to the individual, and there is little to no uniformity in their ranks. Every Anaran man is worth 100 of those mindless creatures, every Anaran officer worth almost 10 of his enlisted counterparts." She paused for a moment, allowing Bridget a few seconds to process the information. "Every city guardsman is worth 5 creatures, every Alathian man worth 3 of theirs, and every Alathian officer worth 2 of theirs," Aline finished. Bridget knew that Aline was probably exaggerating, but she was beginning to understand the point. "We have quantity, they have we have quality, they have quantity," Bridget interjected. "To put it in the simplest of forms, yes." "Do we really want it in the simplest of forms?" Fears asked. "For now, that would be best. We can talk about moral and ethical codes later," Aline said loudly to be heard over the wind that had once again began to prevail. "The strategy will be to hold the bridge at all costs. The wolf doesn't mean for this to be a crippling blow, but if we give him the opportunity, he will take it. So, we don't give him the chance," Bridget responded solidly.
Funnels! I've always loved funnels. Funnel cake, lab funnels, sales funnels, funnels for force-feeding people. Honestly, there are no ends to the uses of funnels. Not that the funnel cake is good for eating. It just burns nicely. Anyways, more to the point. Alpha and Aline both knew a great deal about defense and the use of funnels. Aline used Varen's bridge to funnel the enemy at the castle, and Alpha used a cave system where only one passage, or funnel, led to him. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 5. Continued. Caden. Survival. The place smelled acutely of death. The overpowering rot, mixed with the dank cold air of the cavern, smothered my senses, and from the look on Alira's face, she felt the same way. My first thoughts were for my team. Indera and Rain were still lost. Of course, they'd fallen down the same hole we had, so it was more than likely that they were nearby. Before anything else happened, I had to wait for my vision to finish adjusting. It didn't take long, but once it was done, I almost wished I'd just kept my eyes closed. The pile of corpses we'd landed on rested beneath a dark, gaping hole that showed the clouds above. Strangely, it didn't actually seem like that great of a distance. The corpses were old, wet, and rotting away until the flesh and sinew barely held their places on the ragged bones. Around us, there were at least a dozen different tunnels that could be taken, each one of them marked by 2 torches standing sentinel on either side. I looked to find Indera and Rain, both just a short distance away from us. They were still on the ground, however. It looked as though Indera was, at the very least, regaining consciousness. They had to have landed poorly. Oddly enough, the most disarming part of the experience wasn't the sights, or the smell, or even the fact that we had actually been disarmed by the wolf. It was the sounds. From each of the tunnels, a collective moan reverberated through the cavern, and screams pierced through the rumbling. I got to my feet as quickly as I could. I offered Alira my hand, and she took it readily, and we made our way over to Rain and Indera. I nodded to her as she went to Rain. I helped Indera to his feet, and left him as soon as he was up. I trusted that he'd be able to handle himself from there. I walked up behind Alira, who was still kneeling over Rain. The gashes on Alira's back looked pretty terrible, and didn't seem likely to stop bleeding of their own accord. Finally, Rain began to dizzily make her way back to the real world as Alira calmly and gently placed her hand on Rain's cheek and shook her head. The first order of business was to inventory not just our supplies, but our injuries as well. Once everyone was on their feet, I hoarsely whispered the word, "Check!" and the rest of the squad reported in, one after the other. "Pretty sure my back is screwed," Alira began. "Minor cuts and scrapes, slightly blurred vision, also," she said, pausing for a moment to find her bow in the darkness. "I'm down to 3 arrows. My head is spinning, my neck is awfully sore, and my pride feels minorly trampled," Indera said, pausing to spin his daggers. "No major injuries, though, and I didn't lose anything important. Head hurts pretty badly. Some minor dizziness." Rain paused to slowly and carefully pick her sword off the ground. "Nothing that won't wear off, I think." I took note that she'd handled herself well. "Head hurts, back hurts, nose didn't quite get re-broken," I said, touching my hand to my face tenderly, and locating my sword on the ground near the corpses. "And I think I broke a nail," I commented sarcastically as I made my way over to my sword, before picking it up and sheathing it. I picked the tunnel that seemed the most quiet, but I found that I was using the word quiet loosely. "We'll take that one," I said, gesturing towards the one that was for all intents and purposes straight ahead. "We're gonna have to do something about your back first," I said, turning to Alira. She took off her shirt quickly as I undid my breastplate, dropped my cloak, and took my shirt off long enough to unwrap the wrappings from my midsection. Now wasn't the time to be bashful, nor was it the time for gawking. We both knew it had to be done and went about it. I, however, couldn't help but notice her slim form, slender hip bones, and petite breasts as she made her way over to me. Somehow the dirt, grime, and blood only made her all the more attractive in a fierce sort of way. I wrapped my former bandages tightly around her upper body, folding it underneath the wrappings on the middle of her back. Blood was already lightly seeping through by the time she covered herself with the ragged remains of her shirt. Unfortunately, we needed to move quickly, and as such, we relieved ourselves of anything that wasn't cloth. Luckily, none of us were too attached to our armor, yet another reason why that ceremonial expensive shit was useless. After we were done, I gave a curt nod to Indera, who picked up a position in the rear and gestured for Alira to join me on point. We were going to be rather cramped in the tunnels, and I feared my longsword would be ineffective. The daggers that had remained around Alira's waist, and the hunting knife I pulled from its place in my boot, however, seemed more than promising. As inconvenient as it was, the moaning was growing louder and closer. It was time to move, and so we did, quickly. Chapter 5. Continued. Bridget. Fuck yeah. The fortress had once been manned by a rather large number of guards. Unfortunately, in the time between Varen's rejection of Anaran subjugation and Aline's arrival with the Alathian reinforcements, a lot of men had died. 53 men remained who were trained with swords and shields. The 48 archers were left. It was a sizable force, but against endless numbers, 100 really counted for naught. They had set up on the bridge. The archers were on the walls, prepared for the Alathian retreat should it come to pass. Aline was adamant, however, that it would not come to that. Bridget had been assigned to the top of the bridge. The guardsmen would hold the line below, while she, Aline, Fiers, and the remaining Alathian forces, commanded by a man by the name of Arkenth, held the top portion of the bridge. The trees had been cleared at least a good kilometer before the bridge to aid visibility, and as such, the first lines of creatures were already breaking into the clearing. Bridget could not see how many, but the host never seemed to end as they stumbled along mindlessly towards the bridge. Almost hidden amongst them were 30-odd men and women dressed in dark crimson armor of varying design. The only uniformity amongst them was the deep shades of crimson and black. Bridget had armed herself with the 2 knives that had most fit her fancy while in the armory. 2 more hung from her waist as well. Her armor was the only red to be found on her side of the battle, and unfortunately, movement speed though it did grant, the wool-lined boots were the only warm part of her outfit, consisting of the skirt, leather and steel-studded breastplate, gloves, and black bandage wrappings beneath. The Inaran forces walked along at a steady pace, dropping into a jog as the creatures picked up speed as well. Bridget gave her daggers a brief twirl, trying to settle her stomach. She knew she'd fought before. She knew she was well trained. And yet this felt like her first battle. She turned to Aline, who stood calmly at her left side. Aline's armor was exactly like everyone else's, except that the gray of her armor had been replaced with white. She held a short sword in her right hand and a small dagger with the blade following her arm in the left. Arkenth stood to her left. Seasoned and ready for a fight, he wore a scowl along with his Alathian armor, and held a simple sword and a large kite shield like the rest of the Alathian men. Varen stood on the bridge below, sword sheathed, and determination on his brow. Bridget could have sworn his hair looked just a touch more gray than it had before. Bridget chanced a glance at Fiers. He looked calm, but Bridget could see the nervousness as he gripped and regripped the bow in his right hand. His arrows were in a quiver, strapped to his left leg, and a rather short sword was strapped to his back beneath his cloak. Bridget gave him the slightest tap with her right elbow. He looked at her with a smile that sent reassurance through her veins.
"So, after all this, I'm thinking about having a party," she began with a sly smile.
"Oh?"
"It's a private sort of thing," she said as she tore her gaze away from him. "If you catch my meaning."
"Are you ready, men?"
Arkenth interrupted. The creatures were growing close.
"Yes, sir,"
the Alathian lines yelled back.
"I said," he began as he took a deep breath and held his sword above his head, "Are you ready?"
"Fuck yeah!" the men replied, drawing their weapons. "Fuck yeah!" They yelled again with reinforced cries of the guardsmen below. Even Varen and Aline cut their calm demeanor to join in the cry. They screamed one last time. "Think you'll be able to make it?" Bridget asked Fiers as he notched an arrow on his screen. "Oh," he said, shaking his head for emphasis. "Fuck yeah." He loosed another 3 arrows before the creatures were upon them. The battle had begun. People so often attribute to magic that which is simple psychology and plain-out insanity. Not to say that magic isn't real, and no, I don't mean the magic of a sunrise, or love, or any such nonsense. More like turning monkeys into bananas. Not that I would ever do that. That would be extremely unethical and entertaining. Not that I would know that from experience. Psychology. Yes. What Alpha did to the girl was hardly magic. That is the point here. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 5. Continued. Caden. Trapped. The tunnels were even more cramped than I'd feared, and they were dark. We had to fight for every step forward, and defending our backs was no easy business. On top of this, the only light we were provided was in the form of the glow of the water that ran in a torrent around our feet. All of our faces were covered in blood, snot, tears, and traces of vomit. Apparently the smells of 1,000 rotting corpses turned even the most steadfast stomachs inside out. The creatures were weak and without skill, but were also innumerable. Our heart rates were up, the adrenaline was pumping, and it couldn't hold out forever. Already fatigue was beginning to take its toll. My arms grew weak as I cut, slashed, and bashed my way through the hordes in front of me. Rain was silent as the night but tears streamed from her eyes as blood seeped from her minor wounds she'd gathered. Indera was moving quickly as he could, skillfully hopping over the corpses as he fought, and walked backwards, covering our rear. Allyra fought beside me, but spent most of her time finishing off the creatures left on the ground that I hadn't quite managed to kill. "What's the plan?" Allyra screamed over the deafening moans and screams. "We keep moving!" I yelled back as one jumped at me, forcing me to stumble back. Allyra caught my fall and pushed me forward with enough force to knock the creature flat on its ass. "That's not a plan!" Rain cried back. Her sword was barely usable in these cramped spaces. 4 words echoed around in my mind as we continued our steady advance. Cramped, hopeless, outnumbered, and fucked. "She's right, Commander!" Indera yelled. "We've barely made any ground. Just about a click by my best count." "Damn it!" I yelled. Usually I didn't let my frustration show, but I was done, and we were dead anyway. I stopped moving forward, and my men did the same. "Hold the line!" I said, almost too quietly to be heard over the creatures. I threw the nearest one back to me, back into the crowd of its friends. Our halted advance caused them to hold steady for at least a moment. The sounds withdrew steadily as they stood back, staring at us with their hollow eyes. Drool dripped from their gaping mouths, and clotted blood hung from their wounds. "To what end?" Rain asked briefly, her voice cracking as she looked me dead in the eyes. "Ours," Allyra responded softly. Her back was covered in red, and I could see the fatigue in her eyes. Indera saw the fear welling up inside of Rain and pulled her close. She collapsed into his arms, breathing slowly but heavily. Indera caught my gaze with a steady calm. "We're with you, Commander," he reassured me. Allyra gripped my right arm and held my gaze for a few moments that passed all too quickly. In that brief moment, I imagined myself in another life, a peaceful life, with a woman that I loved, children, and a home of my own. That life, it would seem, was not for me. "We're with you," she repeated Indera with a curt nod. "Well, it's not like you could really go anywhere," I said with a soft laugh and my best reassuring smile. "That's not entirely true," a voice said from behind the corpses. I recognized the voice, and I recognized her as she forced her way to the front of the host. "You could come with me." "Irina?" I whispered almost inaudibly. "Earlier. I don't understand," I had told her as we reached my quarters. "If you think that the death of this woman is going to distract me from my duties, then I fear you hold me in far too low esteem," I finished with exasperation. "And if you think that's why I'm sending you out there, then you have severely underestimated my faith in you," she responded, twirling around gracefully, fixing me with a fierce stare. "Then why?" I asked, returning her stare. "You've been raised an Alathian man, but I can see a resolve faltering. It is time that you chose your faith for yourself, as every man and woman must." I considered denying her assertions, but we both knew that she was right. "I can think of no one better to show you some Anaran hospitality than the wolf," she responded for a moment, walking around me as I turned to keep my gaze on her. "They want you, Caden. And aside from that," she said as I walked her out of my room, "you are distinctly distracted by her death. It is at least partly your fault that she is where she is, and a good man would want to search for her," she began. "But a better man would recognize what needs to be done regardless," I interrupted. "Luckily, you can do both," she said, standing just outside of my doorway as I grabbed the door with my left hand. She placed her right on my cheek and her gaze softened. "Just remember, Cade," she said with more emotion than I'd come to expect from her. "We want you too." Present day. "You know her?" Allyra whispered as she pressed closer to me. "Who the hell is she?" "Not the time," I almost barked back my response. "Not here, not now." "Your companions will have to stay here," Irina interrupted smoothly. "I can guarantee their safety, so long as nobody tries anything," she finished, eyeing Allyra coldly. "You can't," Allyra began as I cut her off with my response. "I'll go." I said calmly, standing up to my full height, while shaking Alira off of my arm.
Commander,
Alira began, looking up at me quizzically.
what in the hell are you doing?
Losing my shit, I responded curtly. Now throw down your weapons and stay put. They obeyed without any further question. I counted out his money, and it made a pretty penny. I put it in my pocket, and I took it home to Jenny. She sighed and she swore that she never would deceive me. But the devil takes the women, for they never can be easy. Oh, Irish people and their folk songs. Carry on. Nothing to see here. Off you pop. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist. Chapter 5. Continued. Bridget. Survivors. The battle was relentless. The Elaithians, as they had been in her vision, stayed true to their color, keeping in tight formation and covering each other. Bridget was the wild card, sliding between the stances of the Elaithian lines, delivering blows that they would never have chanced themselves. The strategy was overwhelmingly effective, and the Anaran forces stood little chance atop the bridge. Unfortunately, the story was much different below. Varen had been injured, though he refused to retreat, and at the end of the day, the crashing waves of the creatures were a force of nature. Bridget glanced over at Fears, who was still using his bow, even at this close of a range. He glided gracefully around blows, shooting men at point-blank range, and other times saving men from fatal blows by killing their opponents from afar. Arkanth barked out orders to the Elaithian ranks as they took different formations at his command, going from groups of 4 or 5 to a solid wall. Aline was fighting her own battle, along with Fears, ahead of the main combat. The fluidity of her motions was like watching a dancer carve through a torrential downpour without getting wet. As impossible as it seemed, she made it happen. As the guardsman's line crumpled below, Aline caught Bridget's gaze as well as Fears. She gestured down with her eyes before briefly engaging an Anaran man, throwing him into the Elaithian wall of shields. Bridget got the message, though she wasn't rather fond of it. She shouted to Arkanth over the clashing of steel and the screams of battle, making him well aware of their plan. From their position above the lower bridge, it was only a task of gathering courage and jumping to get to the wider bridge below. Bridget glanced down for a few moments, thinking of what Fears and Aline had said about rotting wood, before taking a few short breaths to mentally prepare herself. She watched Aline jump, landing on a creature for patting, and then rolling off the corpse into the fray. Fears took a more basic approach, rolling on the wood as he landed amongst the blood and corpses. Bridget jumped, feeling her stomach fly into her throat as she aimed herself towards the clearest landing spot. It was only a 10-foot drop, but the supposed bottomless pit below tended to add to the anxiety of it all. She landed in a shallow pool of wet and partially coagulated blood from the creatures as she rolled through some internal organs of some sort before springing to her feet deftly, as blood shot off of her like water off of a snapping towel. She joined in the fighting, finding it much more exhausting than what she'd been doing above. For every one that she killed, 2 took its place, and at this point, she no longer could even see Fears and Aline, as she slipped, skidded, and tripped amongst the blood, entrails, and corpses of the dead. Her only comfort was the speed of her daggers that kept the creatures at bay. But for how long? Now Aline, in her infinite wisdom, not sure if I mean that sarcastically. Regardless, she saw that Caden was struggling with belief, and rather than smother him, she sent him directly to the enemy. So then, because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Pretty sure somebody famous somewhere sometime said something like that. Anyways, Aline didn't want Caden to be caught in the middle, or lukewarm. She wanted him to see exactly what Anarans were like, so that he would realize just how Elaithian he was. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist. Chapter 5. Continued. Caden, Anaran Hospitality. She led me through what seemed like an endless ocean of corpses as they parted before her like the old stories of Moses. She hadn't talked, and I didn't know what to say. The arena I'd known would have made some sort of sign to show me that she was still with me, still here at all. But she made no such move. Her clothes had been reduced to modest rags, and dark lines covered her body like an unholy maze. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was pocked with endless scars and freshly gotten wounds. Human instinct called for me to try and find what was once her, to try and save her. Alas, I was called to be more than just human. An Elaithian man understood that I could no more salvage any part of her than I could the souls of the damned. Her beauty was lost, her mind far gone, her body eviscerated, and her soul was far beyond our reach. Yet, I still felt a nagging sorrow and hesitation knowing that I'd probably have to stop what was left of her heart very soon. Finally, we came to a large open space that was the closest we'd come to a room. Torches that wielded a brilliant red, smokeless fire lined the walls. The wolf stood in the center, unarmed and fully man. He was sweating in the heat of the torch-lit room where the water did not glow on the floor. Irina's body was glistening as well, and a light perspiration had formed on my brow, though I doubted it was solely from the heat. "Caden, my dear boy," the wolf exclaimed as he took notice of me. "Not that I'm not glad to see you," he smiled. "Which I am. Glad to see you, that is." He stopped for a moment, collecting his thought. "But what in the hell are you doing?" "I've been asked that question a lot recently," I responded coolly, feeling naked without my weapons. "No doubt Helene sent you," the wolf grumbled to himself, taking a cross-legged seat on the ground. "Nobody ever comes to see me of their own accord." He paused, looking over at Irina, who was leaning against the wall casually. "Well, almost nobody. I'm here for the young priest," I cut in. "Bullshit," the wolf shot back. "I know an excuse when I see one, especially when I'm the one that gave you the excuse to begin with." He had caught me in the lie easily. "I was here to see what became of her." I gestured towards Irina. "Now I know." "What?" he rumbled throatily. "Still afraid of her name, are we? She would be so pleased to hear you say it, wouldn't you?" he barked at Irina. She nodded curtly. "But you only gave me half the truth, so I'll only let you leave with half your squad," he mused. "I think I'll let you keep their top halves." "Aline told me that I should get a taste of Anaran hospitality," I said confidently, taking a few strides towards the wolf. "And according to her, you got the best talent for it in town." "Well, she's not wrong," he said softly as he played with his claw-like nails. "I shan't sugarcoat it, and I'll give it to you as straight as an arrow fired by your friend Alira," he said, clearing his throat as he gestured for me to sit in front of him. I did as I was bade. "The first thing you ought to know," he continued, "is that for all our differences, passion versus stoicism, rage versus calm, recklessness versus calculated action, we have a remarkable amount in common. For our first example, your Lathian principles tell you that you should kill my little pet," he said as he nodded towards an unfazed Irina. "I would have you do the same, and what matters is only the ends to which we use our means. In your eyes, killing her is mercy. In mine, you are simply ridding yourself of a tactical disadvantage. Either way, she is dead. What matters is why she is dead." Irina remained unfazed. "Yet hard-set principles are so often wrong," he growled with a smile, "something that Lathians never account for." I tried not to show my confusion, or my tension, but he read it nonetheless. "It is your fault she's here," he said quickly as he rambled on. "Though I had no small part in it, it is no less your fault. You cold Alathian bastards decide that it is easier to erase your mistakes by whatever means necessary, and from atop your high horse you call it mercy, whereas I take credit for my actions. We know what we've done, and we live with the guilt of it every day. I'm not proud of all my actions, yet I know what purpose they serve. I have my moments where I try to atone for my wrongs, but at the end of the day, there's no place for me after the victory. I'm unworthy of a perfect world. I'm too flawed, too dirty, too inhumane," he growled, showing his elongated canines as his face seemed to half shift from the shadows. "Whereas you still cling to the hope that you will make it through this war with your honor intact." "Your point?" I asked, feeling my head swim from his words. "My point, Caden," he said as he calmly looked up at the ceiling, "is that you can spend the rest of your miserable life pretending to be righteous. Or you can accept what you are, broken, sick, and unworthy of a place beyond the victory, and at least try to right some of your wrongs, starting by saving her." I feigned acknowledgement of his words as I stood to walk over to Irina. She stared past me as I grew closer, never once meeting my gaze. I grabbed her softly by the arms, trying to make eye contact. "Hey," I whispered as her glazed eyes stared at nothing, far and distant. "Irina," I whispered with some urgency. Suddenly her vision sharpened, and she was looking me dead in the eyes. For a second, I thought I'd brought her back with naught but a name, but her feral scream proved me wrong as she tackled me to the ground. There was a complete lack of intelligence in her eyes, and no small amount of hatred. It reminded me only of the eyes of the creatures which I'd put down without hesitation. I resigned myself to my former line of thought as I pushed her back, trying to keep her gnashing teeth and clawing nails at bay, as I drew a small dagger that had been hidden in my boot. In the flurry, I was only able to jam it into her lower chest, close to her diaphragm. With that one stroke, I watched as Irina came flooding back into the woman I'd held above me. She looked at me with excitement at first, then with the realization that everything was not okay, and lastly, with confusion as blood spilt from her lips. She was unable to speak, but her eyes begged the question, why? For which I had no answer. Her weight collapsed onto me fully before I rolled her softly off of me and laid her on the ground. Tears still ran in thin lines from her cold, dead eyes, and blood trickled from her dried and cracked lips. I was covered in fresh, warm blood as I stood, dropping my knife and walking slowly to the wolf, who was seated on the ground. "What did you do?" he asked smoothly, as Aline so often spoke when she taught me a lesson. "I killed her," I responded calmly. "Why?" "Because I had no other choice." "Wrong!" the wolf roared back, almost causing me to jump. "You did what you were taught, and what I knew you'd do for no other reason than your blind obedience to inanimate principles. She was gone!" I yelled back, feeling my frustration rising. I was worried that I was only angry because I feared he was right. "Don't lie to yourself," he snapped. "You saw her there in the last moments. She was trapped within, and you could have saved her. You, who could see that she was still within. Not with your ideals that can no more see life than I can win a battle without shedding blood, but you, with your own eyes." I looked to the ground as his voice echoed around in the small cavern. "I knew you'd kill her," he said in a soft, fatherly voice. "And I will live with her blood on my hands, but I understand that I did what I had to teach you the lesson." "And what lesson is that?" I asked softly as I looked over at Irina's lifeless form. "That is for you to discover on your own," the wolf hummed. "Now we're going to make a trade, and you're not going to like it. Unfortunately, it is just one more lesson in Anaran philosophy." "I'm ready," I responded, meeting his gaze evenly. "I could kill you all right now. Not without a fight, mind you," he said with a small laugh. "But nevertheless, I'm going to let you go. All but one of you. Now Levan is dead, and Irina with him, so when I say I'm keeping one of you, I'm referring to a live one." He growled. I didn't understand the test. I made the decision without hesitation, based in solid Alathian logic. One life for the sake of 3 was not complicated math. I couldn't pick myself. Rain was the daughter of the Lord, and so my choice rested between Alira and Endera. Endera, I knew, wouldn't let me choose anyone else, and thus my choice was made. "Endera will stay," I responded, quickly rising to my feet. "I'll head back to my squad. If you'll follow a few minutes behind, I'll have the requisite time to brief my men." "Very well," the wolf responded, "and take the weapons with you, as a sign of good faith." I turned to leave before remembering something very unusual of me to remember. "Let me have her body," I said as I gestured to the small frame on the ground. It was a request, even if it didn't sound like one. "I'll do you one better," the wolf responded with a ridiculously canine smile. "You may take the body, and with it a name." "A name?" I repeated, confused. "Alpha," he said as he rose to his feet. "My closest friends and my more worthy enemies have a right to know it, I suppose." He rambled. "Regardless of what happens here, you'll be one or the other soon enough." I didn't like how certain he was that my loyalties yet remained undecided. "Alpha," I grunted as I drew Irina's body from the floor. His name had a reputation, though I knew not from where. "Leader of the pack," I said nonchalantly. "Where's your pack?" "Oh, you know," he said, turning away from me. "Around," he said with emphasis, and a gesture of his hands before looking over his shoulder to meet my gaze. "Here," he growled, pausing before facing away from me again. "And there, of course." I didn't like the way that sounded. 3 minutes, Caden," he said without turning. "You best hurry." There are a great many things one could say about the attempt to highlight the differences between Anarans and Alathians, but in the end they are damnably similar. I say damnably because neither was really a force for good, but rather good as they saw it. This would, of course, become much clearer when the whole thing turned vertical. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 5. Continued. Bridget. Wrong. On the one hand, Bridget did rather look forward to seeing the look on Aline's face when she was proven wrong. On the other, however, getting pushed back across a rickety bridge to the point of the feet was less than enjoyable. Either way, she'd have some good to weigh down the bad. She was getting fatigued, and she knew everyone else was wearing down as well, except for the creatures. Sluggish though they may have been, the dead did not tire. Fortunately, Arkanth had long since routed the enemies above. He and his remaining men had joined the fight along the bottom. Unfortunately, their arrival did little to bolster the ranks. Bridget chanced to glance back in between cuts and slices and saw nothing but meat, and guards, who she assumed were made of meat as well, but in a slightly different sense. She fought her way precariously to the edge of the bridge, looking behind her and over the edge, finding the wall of the Alathian side of the bridge all too close. Over the next little while, she found herself finally stepping onto solid ground as opposed to wood. Arrows began to rain from the wall in organized groups of 50, splashing down against the bridge. Luckily, she'd found herself beside Fears, Aline, and Arkanth once again. Arkanth sported an awful gash above his left eye, forcing him to keep it shut against the blood. Fears was covered in blood as well, and judging from the bruising on his face and a slight limp, some of it belonged to him. Aline, however, was remarkably clean. She had her own share of cuts, but all of them looked almost picture-perfect, as if an artist had placed them on her and titled the work, "The Woman of the Bridge." Some of Bridget's scars had reopened, and a few new cuts had opened where she'd scraped against something sharp, though she was yet to be solidly hit by an opponent. Bridget feared that Varen was dead due to his strange absence, but soon found him crowded amongst the men, covered in the same blood and mud as everyone else. Bridget found herself respecting the graying man. The Alathian forces held the end of the bridge, refusing to let the creatures cross onto the mud. Fears had taken to his bow once again, shooting anything that came close to crossing that line. Unfortunately, the defense was slipping, as guardsmen and Alathians alike took debilitating or fatal wounds. Bridget felt her fear mounting as fatigue wore on, but with the fear came anger. An anger that burned through her like the night she touched the bloodied handprint that remained on her chest. She felt it smoldering within until it seeped into her hands and onto the hilts of her daggers, further still to the blades, causing them to glow a white-red fire as they seared through the rotting flesh of the creatures. Her fatigue was washed away by rage, and an overwhelming desire not to die in such a damn worthless fashion. The blades felt as though they cut through nothing but air as she danced around, cuts and stabs with her blades, searing through everything they touched, and sometimes even melting metal. Her only hope was that in the chaos of combat, no one else noticed. Even with her newfound power, she felt the energy waning, and nothing quite made tiredness strike home like a blow to the face she took, which knocked her straight onto her ass. Her blades immediately cooled, and one of the Alathian men soon took her place. Bridget remained on the ground, reeling from the blow. She hadn't seen it coming, but it had felt a lot like an armored fist had caught her in the side of the temple. The world around her trembled violently as the ground seemed to pulse beneath her. A sharp ringing filled her ears as she touched her hand to the side of her head. It was warm and moist. She brought her hand down in front of her face and opened and closed her eyes, shaking her head slowly. She soon had to put her hands on the ground just to steady herself, but it wasn't enough. She found herself lying on her side, with the feeling of a cold, wet mud oozing around her face. The cool of the mud and the rain upon her, with the wind chilling her to the bone, had an almost refreshing effect, as the ringing in her ears dissipated and the sounds of battle returned. It was a miracle she wasn't trampled in the fray. From her new horizontal view, she saw something very odd. Around Aline's feet, she began to see a thick layer of ice forming. It snaked its way towards and onto the bridge in intricate tendrils. The creatures started becoming oddly stuck in the ice, having to yank their feet up for every step. Bridget fought for a better view as she saw Aline nod to Fears and Arkanth. Arkanth gave 5 loud claps of the hilt of his sword against his shield. Bridget could barely hear it, but the remaining Alathian men and women responded quickly, forming a shield wall as the bridge became absolutely covered in thick ice. The creatures could hardly move as the ice wound its way around the bottom of the bridge and twisted onto the upper level, hanging down in large yet beautiful stalactites. Arcanth gave one command to push forward, knocking the most forward creatures down onto the ice, and at one more command, they all turned and dove towards the mud. While most of them were still in the air, the bridge shattered. It happened all at once, as though there had been two explosions, one on each end of the bridge, with the force directed towards the center. The creatures were mutilated by sharp pains and shards of ice that flew in all directions. The Elathians landed face first in the mud as Bridget decided it was a fine time to lay down and cover her head against the shards that she assumed would be falling soon. But nothing happened. The fall of the rain became more intense for just a few seconds, then stopped, as though all of the ice had turned to harmless water before falling back down. As quickly as it had happened, it was all over. The Elathians had already begun to pick themselves up, their dark blue and gray cloaks and uniforms covered in blood and grime. Somehow they looked more dignified and strong, beaten and battered as they were. They immediately went about triaging the wounded, supporting some, carrying others, and dragging the dead back towards the shelter of the walls. Aline had walked up to Bridget first, dropping down to a squat in front of her. She was silent for a long moment, and Bridget could almost feel her icy blue eyes examining her soul. Blood dripped slowly and steadily from the left corner of her mouth and from her nose. All the blood dripping from her looked dark and stagnant, almost as if it was partially frozen. "I was wrong," she finally said, her eyes darting around as she examined Bridget. Wrong about what? Bridget wondered nervously. Did she know about Alpha visiting her? Did she suspect her ties? Had she seen what Bridget had done with her blades? Had she just decided it'd be safer to kill her and call it a day? Finally, she spoke in a cold whisper. "We lost the bridge," she finished as she stood slowly and purposefully. "Get some tents up," she commanded to the men at the wall. "You," she said, pointing to one of the Elathians, "grab 3 others and get us some medical supplies." The girl nodded and hurried off before Aline kept steadily giving commands. "And somebody tell the damn archers to get down here and help." "You heard her," Arcanth barked, starting to give the more minor commands as Aline started sorting through the corpses, looking for survivors along with a few others. Fears helped Bridget to her feet, holding her steady until she regained her bearings. When the dizziness wouldn't stop, he cradled her in his arms and carried her back to the wall, despite her protests. She found that Elathian triage was a cold and calculating process. She watched from her seat beneath the wall as those beyond saving were put down with a swift coup de grace, usually a small blade to the heart or through the back of the skull. Those next to her were all too injured to help triage, but not injured enough to require attention. Those that required attention were given nothing more than a piece of wood to bite down on to dull the pain. Screams, yells, moans, and the metallic smell of blood mixed with the pattering of the rain and the smell of the wet earth around them. The howling wind carried with it soft cries, and pleas to God and every other deity to make the pain stop. Battle was not a glorious business, Bridget decided as she closed her eyes and let her exhaustion take her. Chapter 5. Continued. Caden. The plan. "I'm sorry," were the first words that Alira whispered to me upon my return. I suppose she'd seen the corpse in my arms, and the sadness in my eyes. She couldn't possibly have understood why I was upset about the death of this woman, but she pretended to care for my sake regardless. I caught Alira's eyes for only a moment, mouthing the words, "Thank you," as I placed Rena with her back against the tunnel wall. "The wolf made me a deal," I said, turning my attention towards my squad's waiting eyes. "Unfortunately, Levan is dead, and unfortunately we would have died too. The wolf has offered to let 3 of us leave, so long as one of us stays." Rain looked like she knew she wasn't the one to stay, but he could see her shudder at the mere thought of having to stay. Alira looked as though she thought she would stay if I asked her, and Indera looked me dead in the eyes. "I've always wanted to say this," he said with a sigh. "My soul is prepared. I embrace my death with dignity." I nodded slowly to him. I understood what had to happen, as did Alira. Even Indera looked anxious, but a calm acceptance was over everything else. Only Rain didn't understand. Her eyes were wide, and tears were beginning to fall from the corners of her eyes. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You can't leave him here." "We have to," I responded coldly. "But you know what they'll do to him," she cried almost hysterically. Alira reached over and gave her a soft but purposeful slap to draw her attention. "Either he dies, or we all die," Allyra whispered sharply. "I knew the risks," Indara said with his best fake smile. They continued to try and convince Rain as I looked away. My head was spinning and the entire tunnel seemed to be pounding. Why was I having such a hard time with this? I knew it had to be done. I turned back around swiftly, noticing the pool of blood on Allyra's back wasn't getting any smaller. I glanced at Rain and she stared at me. Her teary eyes convicted me for a murder as she mouthed the words, "You can't," while shaking her head. I looked over to Irina's body, tattooed, scarred, and bedraggled. I studied her empty face and hollow eyes. "Come with me," I could almost hear her beg. "Huddle up," I said to my men. They were silent instantly as we formed a tight circle. "Indara's coming," I began, watching relief and confusion wash over his face. Allyra, on the other hand, was only confused. "But," she began as I fixed her with a cold stare, "you know what the wolf would do to him. Why would this decision not haunt you if you were in command?" "That," she said, bringing her face close to mine, "is why you're in command. You're called to be stronger." "I am called to lead my men," I spat back angrily. "I will not leave even one to this hell." I closed my eyes, taking a breath. "Are you with me?" I asked calmly as I studied her expression and watched her glare soften and her anger subside. "I'm with you," she whispered in soft acceptance. "All right then," I whispered, placing my right hand on her cheek reassuringly. "Here's the plan." "That's not much of a plan," Indara said lightheartedly, giving voice to what we were all thinking. "In my defense," I said with a small smile, "I don't have much to work with." "So," Allyra said, casually reaching for her knife, "do we go now?" 3, I whispered, grabbing a hold of my own weapons as everyone else did the same. 2. The creatures did not react to us as we slowly got to our feet with our weapons in hand, changing positions so that once again Allyra and I led while Indara took up the rear. 1. We all moved at once, with impressively more speed and urgency than we had on our way down. After what seemed like an eternity, albeit a shorter eternity, we had reached the central cavern. Unfortunately, the hole was far above our reach. Even less unfortunately, every hall around us was echoing with the moans and snarls of the corpses. And even less fortunately, we found our feet stuck in the mud as though we'd stepped through quicksand. The mud snaked around our ankles and calves like spiked tentacles, cutting us as we tried to move. Rain screamed as she fell to her knees with the now appendage-like mud wrapping around her hands and arms, as well, using sharpened rocks that were in the soil as spikes to hold us in place. Once we'd stopped squirming, the mud relaxed and stopped coiling. Indara, Allyra, and I were all bound with our arms pulled at an angle and our legs about shoulder width apart. Rain had it the worst, for she'd taken the longest to stop moving around. The mud coated everything below her waist and the entire length of her arms up to her shoulders. Even her midsection was held fast. I was to the far left, Indara to my right, and a meter or two behind Allyra. Allyra was as far forward as I was, and to Indara's right. Rain had been the closest to the exit and was to the right of Allyra. I heard Alpha approaching from behind us. His footsteps were vastly unique when compared to those of the corpses that for some reason refused to come from their hallways. My, Caden," he said, stepping around us until he stood between us and the pile of corpses beneath the hole. "What a valiant little attempt at—" "We will not negotiate," I said solidly as I cut him off, while staring him in his far too canine eyes. "Keep your mouth shut, or I'll kill the pretty one," Alpha growled. Rain and Allyra eyed each other nervously for a moment before Indara spoke up. "Commander, I think he likes me," he spoke with mock worry. And Alpha laughed, a deep, humorless laugh that made me feel like he'd just seen his prey do a backflip. Entertaining though it may have been, it was still food, and it would be eaten. "Now you forget one little thing," he said, crossing his arms and leaning in front of me like a bragging child. "I own this place," he roared, turning around and lifting his hands to the ceiling. We all screamed in agony and arched our backs as the mud tightened its grip, ripping through our hardly passable armor and digging through flesh and meat. Indara was the first to grit his teeth against the pain as he fell silent. "From the creatures to the people who enter, from the torches to the wind," he shouted as the torches in the hallway extinguished, then reignited, brighter than before, and the wind blew with enough force to send a man reeling. He walked back up to me, slowly as the wind kept blowing, and he shifted to his fully wolf form. "From the rain to the bloody ground," he snarled in my face before returning to a man. The wind ceased, and the only sound remaining was Rain's muffled sobs, and all of our ragged and pained breathing. "You are in my lair," Alpha said, with his back turned to us as he stared out of the hole in the ceiling. I took a look at Indera. He appeared to be fine, aside from the blood dripping from places where the mud held him. Allyra, however, was beginning to look faint, presumably from blood loss. Rain, of course, was less than okay from her position on the ground. "I see what you are trying to do, and I commend your efforts," he complimented. "Well, you can take your commendations," Indera spoke up again. It seemed he'd already decided to die, "and shove them up your furry ass." As quickly as any of us could blink, Alpha was in front of Indera. He reached his right hand back before plunging it through Indera's diaphragm, reaching clear through him. Indera shut his mouth with surprise first in his eyes, then acceptance, and finally anger as he soundlessly glared at Alpha, who only smiled in return. Alpha pulled his fist from the man swiftly, walking away. Rain cried something that was immediately muffled by the mud that wound its way around her mouth, leaving only her nose to breathe through. Indera sputtered and coughed as blood poured from his mouth. He fell to his knees as the mud receded. He looked at me and smiled that stupid smile before coughing one last time and falling on his face. "It's too bad," Alpha said as he flexed his bloodied hand. "I did kind of like him." "If you have nothing to say," I spat, "then say it and be done." "Oh no," Alpha whispered, staring out of the hole in the ceiling, as if he were looking for the moon. "I like to play with my food." I could see Allyra starting to lose her temper, but I caught her eyes before nodding slowly. We both took a breath, closing our eyes. We'd both been taught that nothing good came of frustration and rash action, so we calmed ourselves, each trying to come up with some idea of how to escape. I thought of a place that I'd never been to, yet always felt so familiar. A place where the landscape was made of medium-sized rolling hills going as far as the eye could see, all of them covered in long, dark green grass that waved back and forth in a soft breeze. I lay on my back in the grass as a soft rain fell from the light gray rolling clouds above that seemed to mirror the hills below. There was a chill in the air, enough to make a man cold, but not enough to shiver. Something was different this time, though. As I lay there, I felt my blood turn to ice, and a frigid air passed between my lips, which I felt turning blue and numb. Even the water in my eyes began to freeze as I took a breath of the cold air. I held the breath as the cold grew to my hands and feet, freezing the grass around me. I opened my eyes slowly, holding my breath as I came back to the real world. Everything looked as though I was staring through a thin piece of ice, Alpha still with his back turned. I looked down and saw that the mud around my feet had turned to ice along with the mud around my hands leading to the ground. Allyra's eyes were still closed, but Rain was staring at me with a stunned expression. In that moment, I felt as though the ice was a part of me, an extension of myself. I let the cold build inside of me as I closed my eyes again. With my eyes closed, I could feel the pressure building in the ice around me. I held my breath until it was no longer bearable, willing the ice to explode towards Alpha. I sharply exhaled as I opened my eyes. The ice rushed forward in sharp shards of glass. The moment hung in the air, like it was slowed by the cold. I watched Alpha turn at the sound, and simply whisper a quiet word. Unexpected. The shards brought him down as I landed on my hands and knees. I was on my feet quickly, unsheathing my sword as I made my way to Allyra. I went to her, cut her hands and feet free, but the mud around both her and Rain turned to ice slowly, breaking off of them and shattering towards the hole in the ceiling. Allyra fell forward, and I caught her lightly with one arm as I turned to watch the hole. I knew what needed to happen, and it happened. The rain falling through the hole turned to ice, joining with the mud until it made a jagged ladder. I signaled Rain forward as Allyra found her feet. We climbed out quickly, Rain first, Allyra next, and myself last, only stopping to glance at Alpha, who was still on the floor, pincushioned by shards of ice. Once we were on the surface, I made a ceiling of ice to cover the hole from whence we'd climbed. I felt weak as I turned to Allyra and Rain. Rain was wide-eyed and open-mouthed, with not a word to say. Lyra pursed her lips and gave me a small smile, with a look that said, "Not bad." We scrambled to the top of the bowl of the graveyard, and I glanced back, seeing the pools of glowing water in the shallow graves, and stared for a moment at the icy ceiling I'd somehow created. It glistened and glowed with the rest of the water. It was all quite stunning, and it was a beautiful view, but we had no time for stunning views. "Check," I gasped with my hands on my knees. Creating the ice had taken something out of me. I glanced down, noting long scrapes that ran the length of my body where I suppose the mud had wrapped during Alpha's speech about wind and torches. My clothes were hardly existent. My shirt was made up of scraps, and only my torn pants and boots bore any semblance of what they'd been before. I looked to Alira and Rain, who were checking themselves as well. Rain had the worst of it. She was covered in cuts and scrapes from literally her toes to the top of her head. Her clothes were all but gone, save for the wet rags that clung to her, barely covering anything private. Alira was in much the same condition, though her bandage wrappings had held together much better than any of her shirts. Her right side was mostly exposed, including her breast, which was covered in scrapes. Her left side, however, seemed largely unharmed. Rain began, not knowing where to start. "Nothing lethal," she said, looking up at me and then down at her shaking hands. "And, yeah," she breathed softly. "Cuts and scrapes, some minor bruising," Alira said, examining the right of her stomach where one of the largest scrapes was. "My back isn't getting any better," she said, closing her eyes briefly. "Blood loss, taking a toll as well." She stopped for a moment, looking over at Rain, and then over to me. "And overall pain," she said, looking down and tentatively touching her breast. It looked painful, and I needed to stop the bleeding on her back. I motioned for her to sit, and she obeyed. The bandages had been soaked through by both blood and water, and now blood dripped down her back from the soaked cloth. I unwrapped the worthless cloth, exposing the deep lacerations to the rain. She grimaced and set her jaw as I warned her that this might not feel good. I closed my eyes once again, breathing in the cold, concentrating all of it into my right index finger. I opened my eyes and watched as my finger turned an icy blue and trailed a fine mist. I wrapped my left arm around her to hold her in place, bracing her against the ribs. She grabbed onto my arm, digging in with her nails. I ran my finger along the topmost of the deep marks as she tensed and gasped, despite her desire to keep her lips closed. The ice stopped the bleeding, as sure as any cauterization. I ran my finger down the second line, her skin making a faint hissing sound as it froze together. She cried out once again, and squeezed my arm tighter, and Rain looked away. I began to feel dizzy as the cold in my fingers started to fade. It was draining me, and I had to finish quickly, so I did, running my finger down the last jagged line as she screamed without reservation into the cold, dark forest. She held in her sobs well, taking slow, forced, labored breaths with only the occasional moan. I coughed as I fell onto my back, looking up at the canopy of trees, feeling the rain dripping through them and onto my face. Everything following that was a blur of darkness and brief sounds. I thought I heard Rain telling us we needed to move. I opened my eyes briefly, seeing Alira and Rain helping me to my feet. I could see their lips moving, one side of Alira's face covered in mud, but all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing. I blinked, and we were in a different part of the forest, my arms around Rain and Alira's shoulders as we fumbled through the brush. I knew I was walking, but they hardly felt like my legs. I felt the rain stinging all of the cuts that it dripped and fell into, making my entire body buzz with a minor pain. When I opened my eyes again, Rain and I were both supporting Alira, who looked almost as far gone as my mind felt. I heard the rustling of the leaves and the shuffling of our feet, even the soft moans from Alira and the cries of, "We're almost there," from Rain. When I opened my eyes again, we were in front of the hastily constructed temporary ice bridge, surrounded by mangled corpses, rotting entrails, and random body parts. We fell to the ground, no longer able to support ourselves, dragging Rain down with us. Rain lay on her back, gasping for breath, covered in mud and blood. The ground smelt metallic, and the air smelled of rot. I knew I was losing my mind as I heard a music ringing in around my head. It took over all the other sounds. It was dark, gothic, and orchestral, the female voices crying almost as much as they sang. I fell to my hands and knees, looking over at Alira, who lay on her back as well. I blinked groggily, trying to remain conscious. Alira's head lay to one side, her eyes closed. Her slim upper body was nothing but cuts, blood, and mire covered her body as sure as any clothes. Only small sections of her skin were visible where the rain had washed her clean. Her left boot was missing, and her ankle was twisted at an awkward angle. In that moment, I figured I knew why we'd been supporting her when I'd last opened my eyes. I could even vaguely remember falling as she'd screamed when it had happened. I looked up to see 3 men and a woman rushing across the bridge, wearing Alathian colors. I closed my eyes, leaning back and resting on my heels while balancing on my knees. The music grew louder and louder as I tried to cover up my ears to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. It was inside my head. I opened my eyes to see the woman waving her hand in front of me. She was saying something, but all I could hear was the music and screams in my mind. I closed my eyes and yelled as the screams overtook the music, drowning out everything else. It stopped suddenly, echoing around in the darkness that now surrounded me. I felt my back fall upon the cool muck beneath me, and everything faded away.